What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall, and today I'm joined with my co-host, Jax McNamara. Great to see you, Jax.
So glad to be here again. It's been a while.
Yeah, it was wonderful seeing you recently at the Pittsburgh ISPS conference. It was a bit of a reunion, and we have kind of a reunion today because I'm very excited about our guest, Caty Simon, who is a longtime friend, ally, comrade, organizer with the Freedom Center, many years involved in the MAD movement, and now is focusing on harm reduction and sex workers' rights. Do you want to introduce Caty for us, Jax?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, Caty Simon has spent more than 20 years in the low income rights, psychiatric survivors' rights, sex workers' rights, and drug users' union movements. She's a leadership team member of and a sex worker liaison for National Survivors Union, the United States National Drug Users Union, and executive staff in two of its affiliate groups across the country. Caty is one of the main organizers with the Freedom Center in Western Massachusetts and the instigator of Poverty is Not a Crime. Welcome, Caty.
I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, welcome, Caty. It's great to see you again. And we were thinking about we're probably going to title this show "Sex and Drugs," so here we are.
You do have that childish impulse to reduce it down to that, for sure.
Well, let's get started. I mean, how should we dive right into what's a better way to frame?
Sex and drugs is fine. It kind of reminds me of an old school harm reduction t-shirt, like shoot safe and screw safe, something like that. Something catchier than what I just produced from my garbled memory. But yeah, sure, go ahead.
How did you get involved with this work? Like, what is your personal kind of connection to it all?
Basically, I was a baby junkie hooker of 21 in the Western Massachusetts area. I had grown up like in kind of like a mixed class background. I was a first generation Russian Jewish immigrant. I was born en route from the Soviet Union to the United States in Italy when my parents were immigrating. And I kind of dropped out of college and became a black sheep of my Russian Jewish intelligentsia family. And long story short, like many people, I found sex work as an economic survival mechanism that worked for me at the time, like many marginalized people. I had also had been involuntarily psychiatrically incarcerated as a teenager multiple times. So that was actually the first time that I experienced the bare naked reality of oppression rather than oppression within like the soft velvet glove that most of us encounter in middle class environments, right? It was in juvenile psychiatric wards that I realized that people in power can do whatever they want to you. And that realization sort of radicalized me and took me to a lot of different movements. But, flashing forward to 20, when I was 21, when I was starting to use opioids, illicit opioids, and working as a lower income escort in Western Mass. So there were a lot of movements that interested me, but I actually first did start by looking into drug users union work. At the time there was the first iteration of the Springfield Drug Users Union, and I kind of walked into that meeting, and I was a 20-year-old queer girl, and it was a meeting full of 40-year-old cis men. And so I kind of just walked in and walked out because unfortunately at the time, even though harm reduction, true liberatory harm reduction, had its roots in like a lot of Black and brown leadership, we don't often talk about it this way, but Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson were some of the first practitioners of harm reduction. They were using their sex work income to fund Star House, which was harm reduction housing for youth involved in street economies. So Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson are icons of the queer liberation movements. They were both said to have been involved in the Stonewall riots. So, like, even though harm reduction was a movement that, was started in the 70s and 80s by many, many Black and brown people doing underground work, at this point, it had very much centered on the white male cis straight guy who injected opioids as the default client and as the default organizer. And there was definitely this old boys network within harm reduction and drug users union organizing.
I was just curious if you could say what harm reduction is for people who aren't familiar with the term and the movement.
So, harm reduction is the philosophy that drug use is a complicated, nuanced issue, that we should meet people where they are at and reduce the harms of drug use and the drug war instead of working towards an abstinent and drug-free world, which has never existed and will never be possible since, human beings have been using psychoactive substances since all of recorded history. It is not minimizing the harms of drug use, but it is locating them within the social determinants of health and the structural factors that shape them, and understanding that the drug war itself causes harms. And it is centering people with lived and living experience of drug use as prime decision makers about the services and the policies that affect them.
It's a really important piece for people to understand because I mean you were one of the people who helped deepen my understanding of the broader picture of the harm reduction movement and the idea of people who have the experience being leaders, people who are stigmatized, who are the topic is taboo, whose their voices aren't heard, which has a direct connection with the MAD movement. It's the same ethos, it's the same issues because when we talk about harm reduction for mental health, and I want to give a shout out to Bonfire Madigan Shive, who was also really important in my own understanding about this, that the fit is just so helpful because you can say there's, psychosis has been part of mania, has been part of human experience, and it's complex, it's nuanced. Taking substances to suppress, control, heal, deal with our states has also been part of human. So having an abstinence or a preaching or a judgment that says everyone should, always take your meds, or everyone should always not take your meds, or everyone should never hear voices, or voices are good for everyone, you should just embrace your voices. That actually those kinds of dogmas don't really work. That the key thing is meeting people where they're at and everybody making their own decisions and empowerment being the center of health. And the thing that's important, I think, for people to know about harm reduction as well is that harm reduction, please correct me if I'm wrong, but harm reduction does include abstinence as a choice if that's one of the things that you want to do.
Absolutely. Yes. Many people say that abstinence is their harm reduction, or they'll say, I need to be abstinent from the drug that harmed me, but I can use other drugs, etc. It is about person-centered care. It is about meeting people where they're at and having an individualized plan for people's lives instead of creating one-size-fits-all models, which, as you so eloquently articulated it, does not work for people and has never worked for people.
Yeah, so when we were doing the Freedom Center organizing, you were a crucial link and connection with, especially this group Arise for Social Justice, that you were a very prominent organizer with, because we just saw that there were maybe these silos or people weren't talking about multi-issues. But for us as organizers, poverty, the war on drugs, homelessness, it all connected with mental health crisis and helping people get through whatever it is that they're going through with psychiatric abuse and psychiatric oppression.
Yeah, absolutely. Rise for Social Justice was a foundational element in my development as an organizer. When I walked out of that room of the Springfield Drug Users Union, what I walked into was the Women in Support of Each Other Committee at Arise for Social Justice. And they were a multi-issue low-income rights organization, as you said, Will, that was started by Michael Ann Busey, rest in peace. She started this organization around a kitchen table with three other women on welfare. And she was an incredible organizer. She used to get arrested every year for protesting and, throwing her, tiny 5-foot body against the cops, saying that Springfield should be using its abandoned housing for homeless shelters rather than, auctioning them off. Arise saw the connections between so many issues. They were doing work on climate justice, they were doing work on housing, and then they started this Women in Support of Each Other committee. And one of the aims of that committee, and this is how I began working in sex workers' rights before I even joined the larger national movement, was their goal was to de facto decriminalize prostitution in Springfield. They wanted to stop prostitution arrests in the city. And they also had goals around ending the drug war, and fiscally sponsoring the Springfield Drug Users Union was a part of that. But yeah, they were very ahead of their time. And I started working with them in this campaign to try to de facto decriminalize prostitution in Springfield, and also to stop the building of a new women's jail in Chicopee. It was remarkable because, as you said, Will, they were really open to getting input from other movements as well. Like we started like at first they were really in favor of diversion, as a sort of, if I may use the phrase harm reduction in this context, as a sort of harm reduction measure towards, reducing incarceration.
Which is a parallel with mental health, because you arrest someone and instead you put them into treatment, which they learn from us that that's still forced treatment. It's still oppression. It's just a medicalized oppression.
Right, exactly. Like, and after listening to us, they came to the value as an organization that they were against forced treatment, and that they understood the trauma and the way that, medicalized coercive treatment is just, an extension of carceral systems and works in complicity with them. So that was an amazing coalition, and in fact, there was Freedom Center representation on the board, and it really was about like being able to connect like the experiences of people who were both, who were sex workers, who were using drugs, who were experiencing distress that created conditions for them to be psychiatrically diagnosed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and for all of these people to have common cause and to understand these problems from a common lens.
And a lot of it was just how remarkable Michael Ann was as a person. I mean, she had her own psychiatric survivor story. She had experienced forced treatment, and she claimed it and brought it forward and used it as a bridge between these movements. She had an extraordinary impact on the Freedom Center, and I think a lot of people. She just passed away a few years ago, so.
And let's not forget, too, that Arise was so ahead of its time that they ran illegal syringe distribution from their office and got arrested for it. At the time, Massachusetts was only allowing what they called then needle exchange, because they didn't truly understand that, the ultimate goal was syringe saturation in a community, not quote unquote exchange, and they still don't. They were acting completely outside of any sort of legal permission from the state, and they were doing it openly. They were giving out clean syringes and harm reduction supplies. They were groundbreakers in so many different ways.
How did you get involved with the Freedom Center?
Throughout like my experience with psychiatric incarceration, like I knew something was wrong. I knew that I wasn't what they were telling me that I was. I knew that human experience was more complex than that. I had read books like Phyllis Chesler, Women in Madness, which was a feminist interpretation of how women are pathologized by psychiatry. And I read some other texts like these, but I never encountered political organizing around, psychiatric survivors' rights at all. So I was completely alone in this. Like I would read like feminist newspapers, and, there would be articles where there were ideas like therapy is about the idea that we can't fix the world. So what can we do about changing you? And that really resonated with me. But again, all of these ideas and all of these feelings, they were useless when I was completely isolated in this ideology. Like I felt like every time I talked to somebody else from the left, they were with me. They were with me up until I started saying anything about psychiatric medication and my non-adherence to it. And so one day I walked into the Freedom Center. I don't remember how I found out about it. I think there was like a booth at a local event.
Do you want to tell us something about your experience as a psychiatric inmate and how that happened?
My experience as a psychiatric survivor started because of a lot of religious trauma that I was experiencing. My mother, when she came to the States, she had this deep need to reconnect with her faith because, even though Jewish religious practice was technically legal in the Soviet Union, it was really frowned upon. You would get kicked out of the party, you wouldn't be considered for good positions, etc. So she had been completely secular in the Soviet Union. So she became what's known as a Baal Teshuva, returnee to the faith. And she became very Orthodox Jewish. And she sent us to a modern Orthodox Jewish day school. So half the day we did English, math, whatever. And then half the day we would do Talmud and Torah and Mishnah. And intellectually, it was a really exciting world for me. I mean, basically, studying Talmud is kind of intellectually analogous to studying constitutional law. So for like a nerdy, nose-picking 12-year-old girl, it was kind of paradisical in that sense. And then these rabbis who some of them were even being forced to teach women for them to be like, to give me like that special dollar to say, you asked a really incisive Talmudic question. I love that stuff. But otherwise, it was really difficult for me because like this was the Orthodox Boston Jewish aristocracy. They were incredibly rich. They were incredibly insular. And I was Russian Jewish scholarship trash. And I was like catching up on all these norms of this community that I had no idea about anything in it. And it didn't help that I was also a feminist bisexual heretic. I mean, I got guidance from rabbis there. Like, I couldn't even tell them, like, I'm bisexual. Like, I had to say, like, I'm friends with a lot of LGBT people. And, like, how do you reconcile that? And I got told things by the rabbis like, that gay sex must be wrong because people don't even do it face to face. They're like animals, which first of all shows a complete lack of sexual imagination, A. And B, I was told this by a rabbi who was a virgin himself. So, who knows? And then, like, also just the relentless misogyny. I was chastened for hugging my brother in the hallway because there was a religious norm called Shomer Negia, meaning that you could not touch a member of the opposite sex. The rabbi who chastened us in the hallway, I was like, he's my brother. And he's like, it doesn't matter. It's what it looks like. We had to wear skirts below our knees. We had to wear sleeves below our elbows. And you were scolded by a teacher and you were yelled at if they thought you were, quote, distracting to boys. So there was a lot of misplaced slut shaming. There was just it was a horrific environment for someone like me. And I got to this place where I became manic because I was staying up all night. I was being sexually abused by an 18-year-old guy when I was 12. And I would stay up all night talking to him, which is like another product of these schools is like they didn't even think that that sort of thing could happen. So they had all these middle schoolers, with 18 and 19-year-old men. I was in the top 5 of my class. I was getting straight A's, in this 10-hour day curriculum. And I was also like I was desperate for anything outside of this incredibly constraining culture. So I was like contacting people, artists and intellectual kids outside of this school system and hanging out with them. So I basically never slept. And so, of course, I became manic. I don't blame my parents or the teachers at my school for this. I don't think they knew any better. But then I immediately, was sent to juvenile ward when I started expressing suicidal ideation. And it happened several times, where I experienced like even more homophobia. Like I was separated from all of the women there, like, and I was put into isolation because they found out that I was bisexual. So, they were like, well, you can't be with the boys and then you can't be with the girls either. And, like the usual, like I don't think my experience was that different than most juvenile psychiatric experiences, like there were the threats of like, we're going to shoot you up with Thorazine in your ass if you misbehave, the stultification, the zombification of being forced onto Zyprexa. And then, I witnessed a rape the first time that I was in one of these wards, and the response from the staff was not to comfort or support the 12-year-old rape victim. It was to call a meeting and tell us all to have better boundaries, so that we don't get pregnant. And their fear seemed to be liability. They like immediately took this girl to get a pregnancy test, even though like that's ridiculous. They couldn't have been able to tell that early. And they didn't understand that if a 17-year-old boy has like some 12-year-old girl like hung up in a corridor, then that is a power imbalance, and that's rape. So those were the kinds of things that I encountered there. Like I saw staff sexually abuse patients. I was going to say inmates. I should have stayed with that language.
Mhm.
Again, that was when I first saw the nakedness of power laid bare, and that experience stayed with me. It made me understand the character of power. So when I later experienced it as a member of other marginalized groups, I knew what it was.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
I knew some of that story, but not all that story, Katie. It's really, it's a lot.
Yeah, yeah. And like the thing is, that was a really typical juvenile ward experience in the 90s. And my parents had good health insurance. I was not in quote unquote bad places.
No, it still happens. I've talked to people. It's similar experiences, rapes or witnessing rapes, witnessing sexual abuse and violence, and then it gets blamed on the victim or especially the borderline diagnosis. And
And shortly after that, as a teenager, I did get a borderline diagnosis just because I was sexually active. I was told by my first therapist, like, so what, are you going to the entire football team next? And that started my interest in, reading up on the borderline personality diagnosis and its inherent sexism.
so we're talking about your psychiatric survivor history. Should we talk about becoming a drug user and feeling how you feel about that, and then becoming a sex worker and claiming that? And
So, like, I know after I told that story, the reaction may be like, oh, so she became a person who uses drugs to deal with her trauma. And I take issue with that. Like, I want to be able to define the reasons that I use drugs, the reasons that I do sex work. And honestly, both of those human behaviors are incredibly complex, have a very long history, and there's a multiplicity of reasons for doing them, like even within one individual, right? I do drugs for a lot of reasons. Like some of them sometimes might be like self-medication for trauma, but a lot of times they're for fun, they're social. Many of the same reasons that, non-habitual recreational users use drugs. I use drugs because part of my daily routine now. And at this point, it's, so normalized and boring and pattern like and moderated by harm reduction techniques that it's basically just, my nightcap. There have been so many reasons and so many ways that I have used drugs throughout the years, from teenage experimentation to this very routinized relationship with opioids that I have now, that you can't really define it by pigeonholing it with one motivation or another. Honestly, the first time that I read, De Quincey, the first time that I read Burroughs,
De Quincey is Confessions of an Opium Eater, yeah?
yes, Confessions of an Opium Eater, yep. All of this literature that I read, what was it? Jack Black, not the famous Jack Black. Oh God, what was the title of that book? It was amazing. It was about being a hobo heroin user. You Can't Win, I believe it's called. It's one of Natasha Lyonne's favorite books. Anyways, from the very first time that I read all these books as a teenager, I was like, that is the feeling that I want to experience. Take me there. So I'm like one of the old generation. I'm not a polysubstance user. Like I like opioids. Benzos are a distant, distant second, and that's it.
It sounds shocking until you think, well, wait a second, we have the same kind of complex, nuanced relationship to alcohol.
Hmm.
No, exactly.
Why shouldn't we be looking, why shouldn't we just expect there to be people who enjoy, celebrate, have these rich ways that they relate to the substance? Because that wall is really artificial, and the wall in a lot of ways is very political. There's a whole military US empire, British imperialism thread here on opiates and cocaine.
Anti-Chinese sentiment,
Yes, yes.
fear of miscegenation, all of these things intertwining, racism, profit motive, all the things you just said. Like, this is a history that predates the Harrison Narcotics Act, but certainly starts from it, in earnest. And yet we know that like human beings have had a relationship with opioids for thousands of years. Like, they're mentioned in
Hmm.
Homer. And Homer writes about recreational use of opiates.
Oh wow, that I did.
Well, like, I mean, allegorically, like the sea of poppies, the poppy eaters, there's a long history of people interacting with opiates. In fact, like laudanum used to be like, a really cheap working class drug in Victorian England. And also, at one point, the main consumers of morphine, like pre-criminalization, were housewives and doctors. So like our way of conceiving who uses, how it's used, etc., has really changed, and the drug itself has not really changed. I mean, supply shift aside, like the drug itself is morally neutral. It's just a substance.
We know that people who use alcohol don't necessarily have a problem or difficult relationship with many of them do. Most of the users of alcohol are recreational users that, and that's actually also true of all the drugs. It's true of cocaine, it's true of the opioids, that people who use heroin aren't all necessarily addicted using it compulsively. Most of the use is not habitual and it's used recreationally and intermittently.
It's also kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy because all of this dare rhetoric about, you're going to get hooked from the first time you try it, etc. Like, people don't even know the techniques to avoid the physiology of dependence and tolerance. Like,
Right.
for a couple of years before I became a habitual user, I used the 3-day rule, like 1 day on, 3 days off. And I did not become physiologically dependent until, of course, I became depressed and I was like, fuck this, who cares if I'm addicted? And then I hate to use the A word, but yes, and then I became physiologically dependent on opioids. There are techniques for not becoming physiologically dependent on opioids and using them recreationally. It's just we don't have like cultural infrastructure to support them.
But it sounds like you are physiologically dependent, but you choose to remain physiologically dependent. Is that right?
Yes, and I'm on methadone, which is an incredible drug, an incredible treatment that allows me to remain stable and allows me to avoid, a lot of the dangers of the illicit marketplace. So I'm not constantly on this ticking body clock of withdrawal that has become shorter because of fentanyl's half-life.
The availability of legal methadone by prescription, which is an addictive opiate, is a harm reduction method, right?
That's why I am so active through National Survivors Union. I am so active in the National Coalition to Liberate Methadone, which is a broader coalition of, methadone patients, people who use drugs, researchers, and providers, because methadone, which is the gold standard treatment for people who meet diagnostic criteria for opioid use disorder. We can talk more about those diagnostic criteria later. There's decades of an evidence base behind it, but because of Nixonian era rigid federal regulations that were originally created specifically to surveil and punish Black urban opioid users, it is relegated to this tertiary healthcare system, into these clinics that are completely divorced from the rest of healthcare, that have incredibly insane rules for adherence. And so, pre-COVID, before we had some regulation relaxations, which we hadn't seen, like methadone regulations had remained in stasis for 40 years. Pre-COVID, less than 20% of people meeting diagnostic criteria for opioid use disorder were actually able to access methadone. Even though it's the supposed gold standard treatment for quote opioid use disorder.
And this is called MAT, medication assisted treatment, right? For addiction.
Medication assisted treatment is a term that encompasses buprenorphine, methadone, and naltrexone. I like to use opioid agonist treatment because it doesn't equate the really dismal health outcomes of naltrexone with methadone and buprenorphine, which have shown over and over again to have incredible health outcomes. Not only do they, help with abstinence if people choose that, they also incredibly reduce morbidity and mortality. They're a huge protective factor from overdose. Like, these are life-saving miracle drugs. And the crime is, why is it so difficult to access them? Right now, there is a bill in Congress right now, the Modernizing Opioid Treatment Access Act, which would allow addiction board certified clinicians to prescribe methadone outside the clinic system. And it's stalled in its co-sponsorship. And so we really need something like that to pass. There have been huge, like, I do want to, tilt my hat to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. Drug users unions have been able to rely on federal partners way more than they have in decades past. We've seen real change within the clinic system. Medication is no longer contingent on counseling, and people can earn take-home doses of methadone without necessarily being completely abstinent from all illicit drug use. And that has been huge. And like, there's been a 5% increase just since COVID of people on buprenorphine and methadone, because there were regulation relaxations around buprenorphine too. Now, buprenorphine is a looser system, and interestingly enough, it's much more available in white middle class neighborhoods, whereas methadone is much more available in low income Black neighborhoods. I wonder why that is. Buprenorphine over telehealth is, a standard practice now. And so, yeah, like, we're seeing so many more people be able to access opioid agonist treatment than have been able to before, even with just this amount of change.
Well, I have a question. I don't know, this might sound like kind of a naive question, but I feel like it might be useful to some listeners. Like, I think a lot of us were raised with these stereotypes of like the people who are habitual opioid users. All of them are addicted. All of them have lives that are a disaster. All of them are in crisis. All of them are in poverty. None of them are doing anything with their lives. Just like all these really stigmatizing, intense pictures of what it means to be someone who has an ongoing relationship with opioids. And I'm just wondering if there's anything you would like listeners to hear about what folks are actually like who are using opioids, like what people's lives are like, what kind of things people are up to, like how do we break some of those stereotypes?
I would say to those people to look at the collective power of drug users unions, like people who use opioids and stimulants for the most part. We were an integral part of making that policy change in terms of methadone. Like, we saved thousands of our community members' lives. We run our own syringe service programs and drug user health hubs across the country, some of which serve thousands of our community. We published the first peer-reviewed paper on methadone published by methadone patients, which, I first authored. We published that paper. We published like the only national survey of the implementation of the methadone regulation relaxations during early COVID. We can do a lot. The combined achievements of our team, if they could just look at that, then I think that they would really change their perception of what a person who uses drugs looks like, and what somebody who is actively using drugs looks like. And for the most part, it's because we have each other's support, and we've been able to give each other community infrastructure, so that we can thrive, so that we can use harm reduction techniques to moderate our use in a way that suits our lives, and live in a way that fulfills us, and reach self-actualization. Like, and a lot of that has to do with, like, a lot of the barriers also have to do with policy. Will was laughing before we started recording this interview about like Caty talking about a jet lag app. I mean, I wasn't able to travel before because And before COVID, even when I started traveling, it was still really difficult for me because in order for me to travel before COVID, I had to make guest dosing arrangements with the methadone clinic in the area I was traveling to months in advance. And even if everything worked out, there was still the possibility that when I got there, there would be a bureaucratic snafu and I would be stuck in opioid withdrawal thousands away from home in a strange city. Now that there's been some regulation relaxation, I've been able to go to France and Australia. I've never been able to travel internationally in my adult life before. Part of the ability to self-actualize is like if you just give us the chance to.
So that brings me to something that you talked about that I think is really important. You talked about the social determinants of human experience, of health, of why someone is in a position where they end up in crisis, or why someone is in a situation where they have a difficult relationship to drugs or to sex work. And so I know the ultimate harm reduction approach would be legalization or decriminalization. Just take
Yep.
the harm of the police and take the harm of the prison system and take the harm of the contaminated supply, take that out of the equation. But a devil's advocate point of view, and it kind of relates to what you were saying about people who say, wait a second, we don't want more drugs in our community. We don't want decrim or harm reduction because it's just more genocide of our communities. How do you support a access to drugs, legalization of drugs in the context of capitalism? How do you get away from the reality that, okay, people are just going to find more ways to medicate themselves into oblivion because they're facing huge poverty, huge stress, disintegration of communities, disintegration of meaningful lives, that the destruction of the human spirit is preventing them to actually have any self-actualization. So here come legal drugs to fit into the picture, because I know that there are some pro-capitalist forces like the Soros network. There are liberal capitalists out there, Peter Thiel, who are saying, yeah, let's legalize drug, let's support. We started with marijuana, now let's do psychedelics, now let's do cocaine, let's do all of it. But these are not people who have human actualization or human liberation or, on their agenda at all.
Yeah, no, that's been the curse of like sex workers' rights and drug users' movements is, the libertarian faction for sure. But first of all, I want to say like you cannot blame drugs for the experience of capitalism and for the self-medication and the numbing people need to do. If we continue to criminalize drugs, we just continue the trauma of incarceration, and people who follow the law will just continue numbing themselves with alcohol and with consumerism. The decriminalization of drugs cannot be a panacea, right? I mean, that's what we saw happen in Oregon is, they decriminalized drugs, but what they did at the same time is they stopped COVID era cessation of eviction. So people got hit with this incredible number of backed up evictions. People were forced into houselessness. And suddenly the right wing media in Oregon is screaming, oh my God, look at all this public drug use. You made these people houseless and you have no social support system.
Right.
You cannot blame the drugs for this. And so now they've recriminalized drugs. And they think that they've solved the problem when they're going to continue, with this dearth of social supports to create that very problem. Like decriminalizing drugs is just one element in, like again, like going back to the beginning of what we were saying about the intersectional nature of these problems, we
Yeah.
need to look at these social problems holistically instead of thinking that there's going to be one or two measures, because there is a whole program of measures that we need to take post decriminalization of drugs.
There's a very strong parallel here with ending forced psychiatric treatment, because you can't just end forced psychiatric treatment and then not address the suffering and
Right,
the crisis that people are going
right.
through, because then you have a neglect situation. And so it becomes an either or. People think the only way to provide services to people is to force them into treatment, or to force them into, or criminalizing drugs and then forcing people through the prison system, through carceral mechanisms, into forced addiction programs. And actually, what you need is both a way in which you're going to remove the violence that policies inflict and also create actual supports and alternatives so that it's not just, ending forced treatment or neglect. And it's not just legalizing drugs and not addressing the housing situation, not addressing poverty, not addressing all the problems that we have with capitalism.
And, we saw that. We already saw that with Reagan era deinstitutionalization, and the lack of support and care that was given to
Exactly.
people there. Also, I want you to stop conflating legalization and decriminalization. They are two very different models.
Well, help us understand the difference then. Yeah.
Okay, so decriminalization is striking the laws that criminalize from the books. Whereas legalization often is an intricate system of draconian regulation of whatever that thing is. And I am completely for decriminalization of sex work because otherwise we get systems like Germany's tiered system of registered sex workers versus the underclass of unregistered sex workers.
Kind of like the legal registered marijuana growers in California versus the underground.
Right, exactly, exactly. I mean, that's the other thing. Like New York State now is having like this affirmative action campaign where they are telling these legalized marijuana growers that they need to hire people with criminal records for marijuana. Because what happened in most of these states is like the people who were criminalized for marijuana, mostly black and brown people who actually had experience growing in the industry, were still punished. They still had that on their record. Meanwhile, a whole bunch of white bros got into the business and, made themselves rich. And how is that fair? So, yeah, I mean, I see a lot of problems with legalization, the problems, as you say, that stem from capitalism, and also just from draconian regulation that, stems from people's stigma and misunderstanding of these issues. And so that's why I do prefer decriminalization, for both these issues.
Do you want to help us understand a little bit about the fentanyl crisis? Because that's a lot in the headlines and it becomes like another scare tactic, another hot button that is driving more draconian war on drugs kind of policies. Help us understand that.
Sure, you cannot ingest fentanyl by touching it. Most of these police officers who say that they are having panic attacks. I think, unfortunately, fentanyl is the new normal in the East Coast. People's tolerance has now just adjusted to it. Like a lot of this could have been avoided with community driven drug checking. Like one of our affiliate groups, North Carolina Survivors Union, which full disclosure, I also work for. We have community driven drug checking. We have our own FTIR machine. We're able to give actionable results to people from their samples in seconds within 10 minutes.
Seeing the purity of the drug by testing it to make sure that it's not contaminated with something.
So I'm not a drug checking expert, so take it with a grain of salt or a grain of fentanyl, as you will. You can see what it's composed of. And so people can make decisions based on that. And that's really helpful. Yeah, I think that if we had widespread community drug checking at the time, then we would have been able to like really be able to have like and to like have coalitions with drug sellers, which a lot of drug checking programs, both community driven drug checking programs like that at Chicago Recovery Alliance and North Carolina Survivors Union, and progressive harm reductionist researchers in alliance with drug users unions have, they have direct relationships with drug sellers who do not want to kill their customers, right? So if we'd had all that in the beginning, like in 2015 in Massachusetts, I don't think we would be seeing a lot of this now. I mean, part of this is a lack of choice. Like, I think people misunderstand the power that low-level drug sellers have, which is why we have all of this, really misinformed drug-induced homicide legislation. Because people get this stuff from the top. They are not the ones that are mixing it up, and they are not the ones who make the decision about cost saving, about where you get supply. But now, with like interdiction, with COVID era lack of supply and like the, interruptions to the supply infrastructure, fentanyl and xylazine are unfortunately here to stay. And I think we still have a chance of saving the West Coast. We still have a chance of saving Europe. We still have a chance to work with drug sellers to try to stop, the spread of xylazine into opioids, but we have to actually start implementing those solutions instead of continuing to create more criminalization and hysteria. Like scheduling xylazine and putting more people in jail is not going to help anybody.
The only reason that fentanyl and xylazine are part of the equation at all is because the opioids are illegal. So people find other alternatives, and often it's more potent alternatives that are easier to smuggle. Is that correct?
Exactly, exactly. It's the iron law of prohibition, right? If you can transport something that's more potent and smaller and it's easier to smuggle, then of course that's what you'll do as a business person. I would actually rather talk about for a second the diagnostic criteria of opioid use disorder and how the MAD movement has helped me understand how to look at some of these understandings within addiction medicine of substance use disorder. Like, I really think that the way that the MAD movement helped me understand diagnostic criteria to learn that the DSM-5 and all of its predecessors were actually created for insurance categorization. To read Dr. Paula Kaplan's accounts of like the incredible misogyny and the weird committee consensus and groupthink that created these diagnoses, and to understand that they are not objective medical entities. These are stereotypes of people, these are stigmatizations of people. That really helped me understand the pathologization of people who use drugs. And I just want to look up really quickly, the diagnostic criteria for opioid use disorder, for instance. Like, okay, so my point is, and I think many psychiatric survivors will understand this, because if you look at a lot of diagnostic criteria, like speaking of the social determinants of health, they exist in this individualized apolitical zone where there is no societal external stimulus, right? So, like, opioids are often taken in larger amounts or over a longer period of time than intended. That is the physiological phenomenon of tolerance. That's how the drug works.
These are the
These
diagnostic.
are the diagnostic criteria for opioid use disorder. A great deal of time is spent in activities necessary to obtain the opioid, use the opioid, or recover from its effects. I wonder why a great deal of time is being spent to obtain the drug when the drug's price has been artificially inflated by the drug war, and you need to avoid criminalization every time you obtain the drug. Gee.
Exactly, exactly.
Or continued opioid use despite having persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems caused by or exacerbated by the effects of opioids. Could stigma against people who use drugs be playing a part in this person's interpersonal relationships? I don't know. Like, and now that the way that they restructured the DSM-5, it's like mild, moderate, and severe opioid use disorder. You can check only two of these boxes, have only two of these criteria, and you have mild opioid use disorder.
Wow.
And again, since some of them are based just on like the physiological
Hmm.
way that opioids operate, you could have people who are merely taking opioids for pain be diagnosed as having opioid use disorder. And people often are. And those with dual diagnoses of chronic pain and opioid use disorder are suffering the most because, there's so much research funding being spent on giving them just fraudulent alternatives for pain management when what they need is their opioid prescription. I've had drug users union organizers sit in these pain center advisory boards where clinicians are actually having conversations like, well, would it be ethical for us to tell our patients that we're more likely to prescribe opioids than we are just to get them in the door? No, it would not be ethical. Why do you need to have a conversation for us to tell you this?
Hmm.
Also, with the slight reduction in the overdose crisis, which we still have no idea what the causation is there, we don't know why that's worked. And people really cannot rest on their laurels because Black, brown, and indigenous communities are still disproportionately affected by the overdose crisis. And those numbers are,
Just to clarify, we don't
yes,
know why the numbers are falling and why the crisis is slightly improving.
they're falling by a small amount. Like it's the first time there is a significant decrease. It was just announced a month or so ago based on federal government data. And NIDA director Nora Volkow said this is real. This is the first time we can see like something substantial. It's about a 10% or less than 10% decrease.
In the number of deaths by overdose.
Yes. Yes. But we have no idea what the causation is. And we also know that in some communities, specifically Black, brown, and indigenous communities, the overdose rates are still going up. So this is no time for the addiction medicine community, for substance use researchers, for drug users union organizers to rest on their laurels.
Yeah, so this is totally fascinating. We spent a lot of time focusing now on drug use issues. I'm wondering what else are you working on right now that you're really excited about? What are you interested in these days?
Yeah. Well, I am still connected to the sex workers' rights movement in that in 2017, I co-founded a mutual aid harm reduction and organizing group by and for sex working and trafficking surviving low-income cis and trans women and gender diverse people who use opioids and or stimulants and or experience housing insecurity. As you can tell, this phrasing was made up by committee. And yeah, and I mean it's been an amazing grassroots effort. We've done all kinds of things like through our collaboration with the Massachusetts Bail Fund, for instance, on and off through the life of our organization, we've been able to bail our members and their male family members directly out of lockup, which reduces their overdose risk since they're spending less time in incarceration. And they made a special arrangement for us to do that, which allows us to tailor this bailout care specifically to our members. We have one of our members meet them at the door with harm reduction supplies. And if they use opioids, the reminder that their tolerance has been lowered while they've been in jail. We, are able to do things like create this geoculturally specific safer smoking kit. Like the problem is, like I've been saying, even though liberatory harm reduction has this like incredible past of Black and brown innovators, again, like the problem is that as harm reduction has been professionalized and appropriated by public health, the default is the white male client, as I've said, the white male client injector. And in our community, we're able to serve, we're in a city that is 52% Latinx. Most of that is Puerto Rican and Dominican. And our demographics really reflect that. And we're able to really like look into Black and Latin drug use traditions and the way that people use drugs with their clients and the way that people use drugs as women, and the way that they have to avoid domestic violence in their drug use. Like we convened a committee to create a geoculturally specific safer smoking kit, and we talked to people about what they wanted in their kits, what reflected their drug use patterns. And we're now able to not only give out this kit to our members, but to area hospitals, to the Massachusetts Bail Fund, to New North Citizens Council, to like lots of community organizations and healthcare partners in the area.
And the group you're talking about is called Whose Corner Is It Anyway?
Yes, so the group I'm talking about is called Whose Corner Is It Anyway?
How did
Yes.
you come up with that name?
A member of ours suggested it, and it was hilarious, and we kept it. We used to, in fact, it's not even often called much by our folks except for the women's group. So that's been interesting. We kind of go against harm reduction ethos towards a more sex worker ethos. Like harm reduction is like a very open culture. It really celebrates openness. Whereas sex work culture is very much about confidentiality and boundaries, and sometimes the need for exclusive spaces for safety. And we are exclusive. We are like membership is by vouch only. And that's really helped us because we can tailor a safe space where we can do all sorts of underground things that we otherwise would not be able to do. Like people are like, oh, why are you just for women and gender diverse people, cis and trans women and gender diverse people? Why don't you have like, trans men and cis men too? And we had a vote and people were like, I'm afraid that my partner is going to want to claim sex work status. my male partner is going to want to claim sex work status in order to come here and stalk me or, get
Mm.
membership stipends. And so I was one of the few that voted for, gender inclusivity, but I was voted down, and this was like the will of the community. And so, we kind of are against harm reduction culture and more in line with sex work culture in the way that we operate in a lot of ways. Another thing is we don't use volunteer labor. All of the labor that is done by our directly impacted staff. They are paid in cash gifts so that people who are unbanked or people who get benefits can be in leadership. And that's been really, really important to us. Everything that is done, we don't have a volunteer do work for us. Everything that is done by somebody who is a member. You have to be a member in order to be a leader and meet membership criteria. And so that way, everything is tailored toward this population because we are the population. It's been an incredible experience. The fact that we started it with crowdfunding, which was insane. At one point we were able to earn 20,000 a month, like before the crowdfund market became completely saturated. And now we've gotten this diverse portfolio of social justice grants. We just got our first very large grant from this public-private foundation to reduce overdose, RISE Massachusetts. Our crowdfunding model has completely collapsed. So this definitely is a plug to give to our crowdfund as a belated Giving Tuesday gift. Our grant funding is still project circumscribed, and there are still like allowable and non-allowable expenses. And the most important thing for us to do is to be able to pay our staff with cash gifts. And we can't do that with a lot of our grant funding. And it's most important for us to continue to do that. The other thing that I'm really excited about working on is through North Carolina Survivors Union, which is a brick and mortar drug user health hub and syringe service program in Greensboro, North Carolina. It's the flagship affiliate group of National Survivors Union, the United States Drug Users Union. And I work for it remotely. And I'm the narrative development director, which means I write some grants, but also I co-lead Narcofeminism Story Share, which is this incredible project. So narcofeminism, just to contextualize it, it's a global movement by and for women and gender diverse people who use drugs, cis and trans women and gender diverse people who use drugs. And it was started in 2018 in a meeting in Berlin. And in 2019, a group of women and gender diverse people wrote the Barcelona Declaration, which stated, the war on drugs is a war on women who use drugs. It said that the issues of women who use drugs are feminist issues, because that's the thing. People who use drugs have been excluded from so many movements. Feminism sees us as we're too slavishly addicted to be empowered feminists, right? We're victims, we're not agents. And so narcofeminism is about the feminism of women and gender diverse people who use drugs and the feminisms of all criminalized people, right? And so using this as a theoretical underpinning at NC Survivors Union, we've started this story sharing project. It's this autobiographical story development process, which we use to disrupt stereotypical narratives about people who use drugs, and specifically women and gender diverse people who use drugs. And we use these stories that we develop as teaching tools for health and social service professionals and to spark advocacy. And we just published our first paper on the process, and I will send it to you as a link for the show notes. We also just did our first train the trainer model. So we trained a drug and alcohol agency and a drug users union in Queensland, Australia. We did like a few pre-meetings and then a full day workshop with them. They wrote their own brilliant stories, and they are now poised to be able to conduct their own narcofeminism story share module in Queensland. So it's now this model is like crossing borders. And we've used it to tackle like a number of different topics, like We had a module on overdose, on hepatitis C, on the experiences of sex workers and trafficking survivors who use drugs, on the experiences of disabled people who use drugs. The storytelling has allowed us to identify emergent issues. Like we created a new model from it. We started doing a module on the experiences of pregnant and parenting people who use drugs. And what we realized is that neither reproductive justice nor harm reduction have really done justice to the population of pregnant and parenting people who use drugs. Like reproductive justice, for a number of like philosophical, cultural, and historical reasons, has not really done, not really included the needs and concerns, policy concerns of pregnant and parenting people who use drugs, partially, because like abortion and sterilization, those have been like incredibly like concerns that were at the forefront, and, wanting to avoid the stigma of drug use, like a lot of movements led by people of color did, again, justifiably and understandably. Most syringe service programs do not offer Plan B, do not offer pregnancy tests, do not offer tampons and pads. Like I had to look up in a medical journal when I was a baby junkie hooker, like why I stopped having my period. Like I didn't know that opioids could cause amenorrhea. Harm reduction programs, are not designed for people who have uteruses. So we created a new model called reproductive harm reduction to encompass both things.
One additional thing that the listeners might be wondering about is in terms of legalization and decriminalization for sex work. And we hear a lot about trafficking and human trafficking. That's kind of like the framing of sex work. Tell us something about how decriminalization and sex work is the way forward in your view.
There's this ideological positioning that pits, quote, voluntary sex workers against trafficking survivors and does not see this more nuanced spectrum between choice, circumstance, and coercion, right? And also, what we've learned and what, like an evidence base shows us is that the things that harm, quote, voluntary sex workers actually hurt trafficking survivors more. And that's why, for instance, the largest network of anti-trafficking service providers in the country is Sex Work Inclusive and pro sex work. For instance, when Sesta Fosta happened, right?
Remind us what says.
Sesta Fosta, the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, / Fight Online Sex Traffickers Act, when it passed in 2018, basically it's very complicated to explain, but basically there is a clause, a safe harbor clause in one of the early laws that defined internet usage, which ensures that if you are a platform like Facebook or something, or Craigslist, you are not liable for user content, because otherwise, how could Facebook or Twitter or any, or any site that allows user content continue? So what Sesta Fosta did is it created an exception that in material associated with prostitution, the website platform was now actually liable. And so they couldn't allow posting and advertising from sex workers or even harm reduction material from sex workers anymore. Right after it passed, it wasn't even used as law yet, but, about 20 sites shuttered the week after it passed, 20 sex worker online advertising sites. And unrelated to that, but a double blow, the next month, Backpage was, the major online advertisement site for sex workers, the cheap and accessible one, was seized by the Department of Justice. And so now these two measures were taken by the government to supposedly prevent trafficking, but what it did was force people into trafficking, because what online advertisement sites allowed us to do was to advertise independently and procure clients and screen them ourselves. And now what was happening was, we had so many people who were put into economic impoverishment. I saw one person go from doing the lowest tier indoor sex work to working outside and once again being trafficked. She was a trafficking survivor within 2 weeks after the Backpage seizure. She lost the ability to keep up her motel room. She was arrested, so her car was impounded. So she had to
Mm.
go back to an abusive ex so that he would drive her to do appointments. And that pattern happened all over the place, and it drove people into the street. And, they encountered the kind of predators that were in the street and the kind of third party actors who violated people's labor rights and human rights.
So we see the same kind of thing with drug prohibition. It doesn't, drugs and sex are here to stay. You can't just make them illegal and expect them to go away. But if you do make them illegal, they become more dangerous.
Exactly, exactly. After Sesta Fosta and after Backpage was seized, in many cities, street sex work arrests quadrupled or quintupled. And we were seeing, as sex worker organizers, we were seeing a much larger population out in the streets, and these were lower tier indoor workers who were forced out into the street. We were actually being texted en masse by pimps saying, like, the game has changed now. You need me now, baby. So they knew that this was a fine time to exploit people and traffic them. So that is the general rule, that any law, any policy that hurts voluntary sex workers will actually hurt trafficking survivors more because they're more vulnerable and have fewer resources to draw upon. Same thing goes when you criminalize clients. If you criminalize clients, the more you criminalize clients, the more scared they are. Do you know how often trafficking survivors are actually saved by clients? If they can't reach out for help to a client who is ethical, then what are they supposed to do? Especially if you're being kept in isolated conditions by an incredibly abusive third party manager.
You're thinking about some countries that have a policy of like they don't arrest the sex workers, but they do arrest the clients of the sex workers. Mm.
Yes, there is the Swedish model of they don't arrest the sex workers, but they do arrest the clients. And that actually, you should talk to some Swedish sex workers, and also there's like a global evidence base of research that shows how that harms people in so many ways. It drives sex work into more isolated parts of town. It makes clients too afraid to go through safety screening procedures with us. It increases violence against sex work in all those ways, against sex workers in all those ways. But I'm actually not even specifically thinking of that. I'm thinking of the way that US politicians try to leverage the Swedish model and say, we're going to do the Swedish model. But what they're actually doing is they're retaining the criminalization of sex workers, but they're also intensifying the criminalization of clients.
I mean, it comes back to thinking about essentially that if you want to reduce the amount of involuntary sex work or sex work that's driven by circumstance or economics, then you have to basically provide people with decent wages or universal basic income or some kind of social network, or just basically improve the economic conditions so that people aren't pressured into jobs that they don't like, which is actually true of any kind of work. All of us are pressured into jobs that we don't like, or we stay with abusive bosses or exploitive situations because we don't have other options in the economy. So if we improve the economy, so ultimately to me, it seems like the long-term solution here has to start looking at capitalism and poverty and class issues.
Yeah, I mean, when there were resources during COVID for gig laborers and such that our members were able to apply to, one of the things that we started doing during COVID was helping people apply to this pandemic assistance program. And so people got this weird version, this weird circumstantial version of universal basic income. We saw, among our Who's Corner members, we saw that people were able to be much safer. If you had the ability to say no to a date that looked dicey to you because you know that you were getting a few $100s that week, that could make all the difference. That could save somebody's life. So absolutely, this is a question. It does come down to these basic social supports. It does come down to like universal basic income. And these are things that we don't often talk about when we talk about drugs and sex work. And yet we should be.
So, Katie, this has been a fascinating interview. Thank you so much for your time. Can you let our listeners know how they might contact you or follow your work if they want more information?
Absolutely. Look me up on Google Scholar, Caty Simon, CatySimon. And you can always email me at Caty, Caty, at urbansurvivorsunion.org. And please give to Who's Corner if you're able. We are going into a cold winter here in Massachusetts, and people will need all the support that they can get. We do mostly serve houseless and housing insecure sex workers who use drugs. And if you cannot give, which I completely understand, especially because there are so many competing demands on our charity, what with the atrocities happening in Gaza and with so many other worthy organizations out there, please feel free to share the fundraiser. That would be a great help.
Great. Thank you so much, Caty Simon, for joining us today on Madness Radio. And thank you, Jax, for co-hosting.
Anytime.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's really nice to be able to come back to my old Mad Movement haunts and, look at my current work through that lens. And it's always nice to see you, Will and Jax.
You've been listening to an interview with Caty Simon. Caty Simon has spent more than 20 years in the low-income rights, psychiatric survivors' rights, sex workers' rights, and drug users' union movements. She is a leadership team member and a sex worker liaison for National Survivors Union, the United States National Drug Users Union, and executive staff in 2 of its affiliate groups across the country. Caty was one of the main organizers with the Freedom Center in Western Massachusetts and was the instigator of Poverty is Not a Crime. That's all the time we have on Madness Radio. Thanks for tuning in. What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health.